They walked past him every day. They judged him in seconds. They never imagined he would own their future. This is not a story about luck. This is not a story about privilege. This is the story of a man who lost everything and decided that losing would not be his final. Chapter to stay with me, because by the end of this story, you will never look at struggle the same. Why again? Before we begin, if you've ever felt invisible, if you've ever been counted out, if you've ever wondered whether starting over is even possible, this story is for you. I don't ask for much. Just your time now, and if this story moves you, if it reminds you of something you've been trying to, forget or reignite something you thought was gone, subscribe. Because this channel exists for one reason, to remind you that greatness is built in silence, that empires rise from ashes, and that your story isn't over, Dot. It's just beginning now. Let me tell you about Elias Kingsley. Every morning at 5:10 a.m., Elias Kingsley sat on the same bench, same cracked phone, same worn jacket, same silence. The city woke up loudly around him, honking horns, rushing footsteps. Angry faces chasing money they didn't yet have. No one asked his name. No one asked his story, too. Them, he was invisible. The bench had become his office, his sanctuary, his war room. It sat at the corner of 5th and Madison, right where the early risers passed on their way to glass towers that scraped the sky. They moved like synchronized machines, earbuds in, lattes gripped tight, eyes fixed on screens that promised them meaning. They had schedules. They had meetings. They had identities the world recognized. Elias had none of that anymore. What he had was time. Dangerous, unstructured, unlimited time. The kind of time that either destroys you or rebuilds you, depending on what you choose to do with it. Most people fear that kind of freedom. They fill every moment with noise, with distraction, with anything that keeps them from sitting alone with their thoughts. But Elias had learned something in his fall from gray silence is where clarity lives. He watched them pass, these warriors of the corporate battlefield, and he felt no envy. He felt no bitterness. He felt something stranger gratitude. Because while they rushed toward meetings they dreaded and emails they resented, he sat in the space between who he was and who he was becoming. That space is sacred. That space is where transformation happens. But only if you're willing to sit in it long enough. A cracked phone in his hand wasn't a symbol of poverty. It was a tool. While the world slept off its exhaustion, Elias studied. He consumed knowledge like a starving man consumes bread. Failed companies, market patterns, the psychology of wealth, the habits of people who built empires from nothing. He wasn't reading for entertainment. He was reading for survival. He was reading for resurrection. But invisibility has a strange power. When no one is watching, you are free to become whoever you choose. There's no pressure to maintain an image. No audience to perform for. No critics analyzing your every move. The world had stopped looking at Elias Kingsley, and in that neglect, he found the greatest gift: permission to start over completely. Some mornings, a businessman would sit beside him, checking his Rolex, sighing at traffic, complaining into his phone about delays. Some mornings, a businessman would sit beside him, checking his Rolex, sighing at traffic, complaining into his phone about delays. Elias would smile quietly. That man had no idea he was sitting next to someone who would soon rewrite the rules of the game they were both playing. He had no idea that the invisible man beside him was studying him, learning from him, understanding what made men like him move. Because Elias knew something now that he didn't know before his fall. Success isn't about being seen. It's about seeing clearly. 5 years earlier, Elias was celebrated. People answered his calls. Meetings started on time when he walked in. He believed success was permanent. That was his first mistake, confusing momentum with invincibility. When you're rising, everything feels inevitable. The deals close easier. The opportunities multiply. The universe seems to conspire in your favor. Elias thought he had figured out the game. He thought he had earned his place at the table permanently. Then came the collapse. A trusted partner disappeared with company funds. Not a stranger. Not a competitor. Someone he'd called a friend. Someone who'd sat at his dinner table, who'd met his family, who'd looked him in the eye and promised loyalty. Investors vanished overnight, their confidence evaporating like morning mist. The bank accounts emptied. Legal fees mounted. Creditors circled. 1 month. That's all it took. From CEO to zero, the speed of the fall is what shocked him most. He'd spent 7 years building the company, brick by careful brick. 7 years of sacrifices, late nights, missed birthdays, relationships strained to breaking. And it all came down in 30 days. It taught him something brutal. Everything you think is solid can turn to vapor overnight. The foundation you believed was concrete was actually built on trust, and trust is the most fragile substance in business. When Elias asked for help, he learned a painful lesson that would reshape everything he thought he knew about human nature. Respect is rented, and the rent is due every month. The same people who once smiled and shook his hand now avoided his gaze in hallways. Phone calls went to voicemail. Lunch invitations disappeared. Emails went unanswered. He'd hear later that meetings had happened, meetings he would have been invited to months earlier, but now his name was poison. The hardest part wasn't the money. Money is just numbers on a screen, paper in a wallet, ones and zeros in a database. The hardest part was watching people rewrite history. The same partners who had praised his vision now claimed they'd always had doubts. The same investors who had fought for a seat at his table now said they'd seen the red flags all along. Success has 1,000 fathers, but failure is an orphan. Elias became that orphan, standing alone in the wreckage of what he'd built, watching everyone walk away without looking back. He learned that most relationships in business aren't relationships at all. They're transactions. Mutual benefit masquerading as friendship. And when you have nothing left to trade, people stop trading with you. They don't do it with malice. They do it with indifference, which somehow hurts more. Failure isn't just financial. It's emotional. It's spiritual. It's the weight that presses down on your chest when you wake up at 3 in the morning and remember that yesterday wasn't a nightmare. It was real. It's the nausea that hits when you check your bank balance. It's the paralysis that comes from knowing you have to start over but having no idea how. Elias avoided eye contact, avoided conversations, avoided mirrors, because the hardest person to face after failure is yourself. When you're winning, it's easy to look in the mirror. You see a victor, a champion, someone the world validates. You see someone who deserves success. But when you're broken, the mirror becomes a courtroom, and you're both the accused and the judge. Every reflection is a reminder of what you lost, who you disappointed, how far you fell. He stopped going to the places he used to frequent, the coffee shop where he'd once held meetings, the restaurant where he'd celebrated deals, the gym where other entrepreneurs networked between sets. Every familiar place was a museum of his former life, and he couldn't bear to walk through the exhibits of who he used to be. At night, doubt whispered, not shouted, whispered, because whispers are more insidious. They creep in quietly when your defenses are down. Maybe this is who you really are. Maybe that success was luck. Maybe you reached your limit. Maybe you should stop trying and accept that this is your ceiling. Those whispers are more dangerous than any critic, any competitor, any external enemy. Because they come from inside, they sound like your voice. They know your weaknesses. They know exactly where to strike. Some nights, Elias agreed with them. Some nights, surrender felt like mercy. Why keep fighting? Why endure the humiliation? Why subject himself to more rejection, more failure? More proof that maybe he wasn't meant for this. Quitting would be peaceful. Quitting would end the suffering. Quitting would allow him to retreat into a comfortable mediocrity where expectations were low and disappointment was impossible. But something inside him refused. I hope that hope is fragile. Hope can be killed by a single bad day, a single rejection, a single reminder of how far you've fallen. Not confidence. Confidence had abandoned him long ago, walking out the door with everyone else. Just defiance. Raw, unreasonable, illogical defiance. The kind of stubbornness that makes no sense to anyone watching. The kind that says, I don't care what the odds are. I don't care what happened yesterday. I don't care what everyone thinks. I'm getting up again. Defiance doesn't inspire. It doesn't look good on camera. It doesn't come with motivational music and dramatic lighting. But it's the only thing that survives when everything else burns away. That bench wasn't chosen. It was all he had. Free Wi-Fi from the cafe across the street. Time no one wanted from him. Silence loud enough to think. Most people would see it as rock bottom, a grown man sitting on a public bench with a cracked phone and no office to go to. But Elias began to see it differently. This bench was freedom. No meetings to perform in. No employees to manage. No investors to please. Just space. Space to think. Space to learn. Space to rebuild from the foundation up. While the world slept off its hangovers and exhaustion, Elias studied. Not casually. Not as a hobby. With the intensity of someone who understood this was survival. He studied failed companies, looking for the patterns no one talks about in success stories. What killed Blockbuster? What destroyed Kodak? What mistakes kept repeating across industries and decades? He learned more from failure than success ever taught him. He studied billionaire interviews, not for inspiration, but for strategy. He watched how they answered questions, how they thought about risk, how they made decisions when information was incomplete. He noticed that most of them had failed spectacularly before they succeeded. Most had been counted out. Most had periods where everyone thought they were finished. That gave him something he desperately needed: context. He wasn't uniquely cursed. He was walking a path others had walked before. He studied market cycles, understanding that timing is everything. He learned that the best opportunities come disguised as disasters, that recessions create millionaires. That chaos is where fortunes are made by those patient enough and prepared enough to act well. Others panic as he studied human behavior, learning that most people are predictable once you understand their fears. Fear of missing out. Fear of being wrong. Fear of looking stupid. Fear of losing what they have. If you understand what people fear, you understand how they'll behave. And if you understand how they'll behave, you can build systems that serve their needs before they even articulate them. And he noticed a pattern that would become the cornerstone of everything he built next. Most people want results. They want the mansion, the private jet, the magazine cover, the applause. Few people respect process. Few people are willing to do boring work for years before anyone notices. Few people can delay gratification long enough to build something that lasts. Everyone wants to be a champion. Almost no one wants to train like one. That realization became his foundation. He would become someone who respects process. Someone who understands that empires aren't built in moments of inspiration, they're built in thousands of unremarkable hours that no one sees, no one celebrates, no one photographs. The bench became his university, failure became his education, and the silence became his greatest teacher, forcing him to confront truths he'd been too busy to hear when he was successful. It wasn't brilliant. It wasn't revolutionary. It wasn't the kind of idea that gets featured in TED Talks or pitched on Shark Tank. It was useful. That's all. Usefulness is underrated in a world obsessed with innovation. But Elias had learned something from his studies. Most successful businesses aren't built on brilliant ideas. They're built on solving basic problems that everyone complains about but no one wants to fix. Elias saw a problem people complained about every day and ignored because it wasn't glamorous. It wasn't sexy. It wasn't going to make headlines. It was mundane, repetitive, annoying. The kind of problem people had accepted as inevitable, as just part of life, as something that couldn't be fixed. But Elias knew better now. Every accepted inconvenience is an opportunity. Every complaint is a business plan written in frustration. He built a solution no one wanted to build because it required patience. It required infrastructure. It required consistency. It required showing up every single day for years before anyone would notice. There was no shortcut, no growth hack, No viral moment. Just steady, unglamorous work that most entrepreneurs would quit after 3 months because it wasn't exciting enough, wasn't growing fast enough, wasn't getting enough attention. But Elias had an advantage most entrepreneurs don't have nothing left to lose. When you have nothing, you're not distracted by protecting what you have. You're not worried about your reputation because you've already lost it. You're not paralyzed by the fear of failure because you've already failed as spectacularly as possible. You're free. Free to focus completely on building what comes next without the weight of past success creating expectations. He didn't chase attention. He'd learned that attention is fleeting. Algorithms change. Trends die. What's hot today is forgotten tomorrow. He chased value. Real value that solves real problems. Value that people would pay for not because it was trendy, but because it made their lives measurably better. The world is full of people chasing virality. Very few are chasing utility. Elias decided to be rare. He decided to build something that would matter in 5 years, not just 5 minutes. The early days were brutal. Cold emails unanswered, calls rejected, laughter disguised as feedback, interesting idea, but we're going in a different direction, maybe in the future. Let me think about it. Each rejection was a small death. Each no felt personal. Even when it wasn't, even when he knew intellectually that rejection is part of the process, emotionally it felt like confirmation that he didn't belong here, that he should give up. And everyone was right to write him off. Some days he earned nothing. Not a single dollar. Hours of work with zero tangible result. Some days he lost what little he had. A client backing out. A payment bouncing. An expense he hadn't anticipated. The bank account kept shrinking. And there were moments, many moments, when he looked at the numbers and wondered how he was going to eat next week. People he'd once worked with would see him and pretend they didn't. They'd cross the street. Look at their phones. Suddenly become very interested in a store window. The humiliation wasn't loud. It was quiet. 1,000 small cuts that never quite healed before the next one opened. But he made a promise to himself, written on a torn piece of paper he kept in his pocket, wrinkled and worn from being touched so many times, I will not quit on a bad day. And there were many bad days. Days when quitting felt like logic, like wisdom, like the smart thing to do. Days when every rational voice in his head said, stop, this isn't working, you're wasting your time, cut your losses and move on. But Elias understood something about human psychology that most people miss. Most people quit right before the breakthrough. They end your 99 steps and stop at 100. They run the marathon and quit at mile 25. They dig for gold and give up 3 feet from the vein. He'd read the biographies. He'd studied the patterns. Every massive success looked like a failure right up until the moment it wasn't. After 217 rejections, he'd counted every one, written them down in a notebook as a reminder that failure is just data someone said, let's try, to words. That's all it took. To words that changed nothing and everything simultaneously. That single yes didn't transform the business overnight. Money didn't flood in. The bank account didn't suddenly fill up. The problems didn't disappear. But it proved one thing, one fundamental truth that Elias needed to believe to continue. The door was never locked. He just hadn't knocked long enough. Most people knock a few times and assume the door is locked, assume no one's home, assume they're not wanted. But Elias had kept knocking for 217 tries, and on the 218th knock, someone answered. That first client became proof that his idea worked, proof that value could be created, proof that he wasn't delusional, wasn't wasting his time, wasn't pursuing a fantasy. One yes is all you need to keep going. One yes turns theory into reality. One yes transforms you. From someone with an idea to someone with a business. He treated that first client like they were his only client, because they were. He over-delivered on every promise. He responded to emails within minutes. He anticipated problems before they arose. He made them feel like they were his entire world, because in that moment, they were. That first client didn't know they were the first. They didn't know about the 217 rejections. They just knew they had a problem, and Elias solved it better than anyone else had. And that one yes led to another. The first client told someone. That someone became curious. The second yes came easier than the first. Then the third. Then the fourth. Momentum isn't built in giant leaps. It's built in small, consistent steps that compound over time. Elias understood now what he hadn't understood before. Success isn't a destination you arrive at. It's a direction you move in, day after day, even when progress feels impossible to see. Slow became steady. Steady became growth. It happened so gradually that Elias almost didn't notice at first. 1 month he had 3 clients. The next month, 5. The month after that, 8. Nothing explosive. Nothing that would make a headline. Just quiet. Consistent growth that most people would find boring. But Elias didn't need explosive. He needed sustainable. Elias reinvested everything. No luxury. No celebration. No expensive dinners to mark milestones. Every dollar that came in went back into the business. Better systems. Better tools. Better infrastructure. While other entrepreneurs at his level were buying nice watches and posting about their wins on social media, Elias was building in silence. He'd learned his lesson. Success announced too early invites distraction, competition, and judgment. He didn't announce his success because he understood something the moment you announce. The moment you post, the moment you celebrate publicly, you invite the world to watch. And when the world is watching, you start performing instead of building. You start making decisions based on how they'll look. Rather than whether they're right, you start protecting your image rather than improving your business. So he protected his momentum like a sacred flame. He guarded his time. He said no to opportunities that looked good but didn't align with his vision. He avoided the networking events where entrepreneurs performed success for each other. He ignored the LinkedIn posts celebrating hustle culture. He just worked day after day, early mornings, late nights, weekends. Not because he was obsessed with work, but because he was obsessed with proving something to himself that he could do it again, that the first success wasn't luck, that he belonged here. The growth continued, 15 clients, 25, 50, the revenue followed, not in massive spikes, but in steady climbs that compounded month after month. Elias watched the numbers with quiet satisfaction. No one was watching him anymore, which meant he was free to build exactly what he wanted to build, exactly how he wanted to build it. Invisibility that had once felt like shame now felt like armor. It grew. Slowly at first, then faster. The way fire spreads patient at the beginning, then suddenly consuming everything in its path. Years later, Elias stood before a boardroom. Same city, different man. The building was one he'd walked past 100 times during his bench days, when the idea of being inside felt impossible. Now he owned the table everyone sat around. Same streets outside the window, same skyline. But everything was different. When someone recognized him as an older executive who'd been at one of his failed pitches years earlier, they whispered to the person beside them. Wasn't he, yes, he was the man who failed. The man who sat on that bench, the man they'd ignored, rejected, written off, the man they'd watched fall and assumed would never get back up. But now he was something else. Something they didn't have words for yet. The man who refused to stay down. The man who turned humiliation into education. The man who understood that the fall was never the end, it was just the middle of a longer story. Elias didn't gloat. Didn't mention the past. Didn't remind them of their rejection. He simply presented his proposal with the calm confidence of someone who'd earned his place through years of work they never saw. The meeting went well. Of course it did. He wasn't the same person who'd pitched them years ago. That person had been desperate, unproven, asking them to believe in potential. This person was proven, successful, offering them an opportunity to partner with something already working. After the meeting, the executive who'd recognized him approached. I have to say, I didn't think. Congratulations, not really. What you've built is impressive. Elias smiled politely, shook his hand, and said nothing. There was nothing to say. The work spoke for itself. The results spoke for themselves. And Elias had learned that the best revenge isn't proving people wrong, it's becoming so successful that their opinion stops mattering entirely. He walked out of that building the same way he'd walked past it years ago. But this time, he belonged. This time, he wasn't looking up at the windows wondering how to get inside. He was inside. And everyone was looking at him. A reporter asked, "How did you become a billionaire?" It was at an event Elias hadn't wanted to attend, but his team insisted it was good for the brand. The reporter was young, eager. The kind who thought success was a formula they could extract and replicate. Elias smiled. Not a rehearsed smile. A real one. Because the question was simple, and the answer was even simpler, though no one wanted to hear it. I didn't chase money. I chased mastery. Money followed quietly. The reporter waited, pen poised, expecting more. A list of strategies. A three-step process. A secret. But Elias had given them the truth. The whole truth. There was nothing more to say. The truth is simple, but simple doesn't mean easy. Most people want shortcuts. They want the hack, the trick, the insider knowledge that will let them skip the hard parts. They want to hear about the one big break, the lucky moment, the right connection. But Elias knew there was no shortcut. There was just work. Boring, consistent, unglamorous work. Day after day. Year after year. While everyone else was looking for the fast way, Elias took the long road. And the long road led him here. To boardrooms where people listened when he spoke. To bank accounts that had more zeros than he could spend in a lifetime. To a life where he could choose how to spend his time, who to work with, what problems to solve. But more than that, it led him to something money can't buy, the knowledge that he'd done it. That he'd fallen as far as someone can fall and climbed all the way back. That he'd proven to himself, not to anyone else, that he was capable of extraordinary things. Money was just a scorecard. The real game was mastery. The real victory was becoming someone who could build empires from nothing. Who could sit on a bench with nothing and turn it into everything. That's what Elias had chased. And he'd caught it. If this story spoke to you, it's because a part of you knows you are meant for more. This channel exists to remind you that greatness is built quietly. Subscribe for more stories of discipline, wealth, mindset, and legacy. Like the video so this message reaches someone who needs it, and comment below. I will not quit, because your story is still being written.